All right, today we're digging into a story that's frankly pretty wild. It's about how a private trading company, of all things, ended up basically ruling the entire Indian countryside. I mean, they completely reshaped the economy and the lives of millions of people. So, how on earth did that happen? Let's get into it.
So let's start with a number, 10 million. That's how many people died in the Bengal famine of 1770. To put that in perspective, we're talking about a third of the entire population. And here's the kicker. This unbelievable catastrophe happened just 5 years after the East India Company got financial control of the area. You have to ask, how did a company's policies lead to something so devastating?
Okay, so the whole story really kicks off on August 12th, 1765. And you can picture it, right? It was probably a pretty simple ceremony, maybe just inside a tent. But what happened there would change the course of history. The Mughal emperor made a decision. He appointed the East India Company as the Diwan of Bengal. So what in the world does being Diwan actually mean? Well, it meant the company was now the head honcho of finance. Suddenly, their whole game changed. It wasn't just about trade anymore. Nope. Their number one job was collecting tax revenue. And the goal? To get enough money to fund all their own expenses and, this is the crazy part, to buy Indian goods to ship back to Britain without having to spend any of their own gold or silver. It was a perfect self-funding machine, or so they thought.
Here's the problem, though. The company still thought of itself as a bunch of traders, not a government. They had zero interest in setting up a fair or, a sustainable system. Their goal was simple: squeeze every last penny out of the land as fast as humanly possible. So they forced artisans to sell their stuff for next to nothing and hit peasants with these impossibly high taxes. And the result? Exactly what you'd expect. The whole economy just collapsed. Artisans abandoned their villages, agriculture fell apart, and all of that led directly to that horrific famine we just talked about.
So after that terrible famine, even the company officials had to face facts. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that a totally ruined countryside can't pay you any taxes, right? They realized they needed a stable, predictable income. And to get that, they had to figure out a way to actually get people to invest in the land again, to improve farming. This started a huge debate that went on for decades, and it led to all these massive experiments in how to collect revenue. And their first big swing at a quote-unquote solution was something called the permanent settlement. This was rolled out in 1793 by Governor General Charles Cornwallis. And that word permanent is the key here. The whole idea was to lock in a system that would bring stability once and for all. So here's how it was supposed to work, at least on paper. The company basically looked at the local rajas and leaders and said, okay, you guys are now the official landlords, or zamindars. Your job is to collect rent from the peasants, then you pay a fixed amount of that to us, the company. And because our cut was fixed forever, the thinking was, hey, the zamindars will have every reason to invest in making the land more productive, right? Because any extra profit would be theirs to keep. Sounds logical, doesn't it? Well, it didn't quite work out that way. Not even close. For the actual farmers, the cultivators, it was a total disaster. See, the revenue the company demanded was set so high that a lot of zamindars couldn't even pay it and ended up losing their land. And the ones who did manage to pay, they quickly figured out they didn't need to invest a single rupee. Why bother? They could just squeeze the peasants for every last drop, charge insane rents, and leave them totally buried in debt with absolutely no rights to the land they'd farmed for generations. And this really shows you their whole trial and error approach. When the permanent settlement in Bengal turned out to be a mess, they just tried other things elsewhere. Up north, they came up with the Mahalawari system, where an entire village was responsible for the tax. Down south, they tried the Ryotwari system, where they taxed the farmers directly. But look, no matter what they called it, no matter how they structured it, the fundamental goal never ever changed: get as much money as possible for the company. But then, the company had another realization. It was like, wait a minute, just taxing the land is one thing, but the real money, the big money, is in controlling what's actually grown on that land. What if we could force farmers to grow the cash crops that Europe was desperate for? And that brings us to the next chapter of our story, all about a special dye called indigo. A dye so valuable it was nicknamed blue gold. So back then, if you were a cloth maker in Europe, your go-to for blue dye was a plant called woad. The problem? It produced this kind of pale, dull, washed-out blue. But Indian indigo? Whoa, that was a different story. It produced this incredibly rich, vibrant, deep blue that was just stunning. Naturally, cloth dyers were obsessed with it, but it was super expensive and really hard to get. Then, a perfect storm happened. First, Britain's cotton industry just exploded, which meant they needed way more dye. And right at that same moment, the usual supply of indigo from the West Indies completely collapsed. So where did Britain turn? You guessed it, India. And the shift was just staggering. In 1788, India was supplying maybe 30% of Britain's indigo. Just a couple of decades later, by 1810, that number had shot up to 95%. It was a massive boom.
But you know there's a but coming, right? This massive boom came at an absolutely terrible human cost. All these company officials and private planters who flocked to India to get rich quick, they set up this unbelievably brutal system of cultivation. And really, it wasn't a farming system at all. It was a debt trap, pure and simple, and it caught millions of peasants.
Let's just walk through how this vicious cycle worked. Under what was called the Rayoti system, planters would pressure peasants to take a cash loan up front. Sounds okay, right? But there was a huge catch. Taking that loan meant you had to sign a contract, forcing you to grow indigo on at least a quarter of your land, and not just any land, your best land, the very same fields you needed to grow rice to feed your own family. Then, when the harvest came in, the planter paid you a price that was so ridiculously low, there was no way you could ever pay back the loan. So what happened? You had to take another loan for the next season, and the cycle of debt just went on and on forever.
So just think about this perfect storm of misery. First, the price they paid you was a joke. Second, the loans were designed so you could never escape. Third, you had to use your best soil, the soil you desperately needed for food. And to top it all off, the indigo plant itself has these really deep roots that just suck the life out of the soil. After you harvested a crop of indigo, that land was useless for growing rice. It was a complete disaster, both for the people and for the land itself. And nothing, I think, captures the sheer desperation better than this one quote. It's from a farmer, a cultivator named Haji Mullah. In 1860, he was speaking to an official commission, and they asked him, okay, under what conditions would you be willing to grow indigo again? And his answer, it just says everything. He said, I am not willing to sow. I would rather beg than sow indigo. Think about that. He'd rather be a beggar on the street than be trapped in that system again.
Well, you can only push people so far. And eventually, all that desperation and suffering just boiled over into full-blown organized resistance. It became known as the Blue Rebellion. The peasants just decided, you know what? We have nothing left to lose.
It all kicked off in March of 1859. It started simply. Thousands of farmers across Bengal just flat out refused to grow indigo. But it spread like wildfire. Soon they were attacking indigo factories, and they were armed with anything they could get their hands on: swords, spears, bows, and arrows, even kitchen pots and pans. And they weren't alone. They got support from their village headmen and even some of the local landlords who were just sick of the planters' arrogance. The rebellion got so big, so fast, that the British government started to panic, worried this was going to turn into another massive revolt, and they knew they had to step in. So the government set up something called the Indigo Commission to investigate what was going on, and its findings, well, for the time, they were pretty shocking. The commission actually found the planters guilty. They called them out for using brutal and coercive tactics. They officially declared that the system was totally unfair to the peasants, and most importantly, that farmers could not be forced to grow indigo against their will. And the impact was immediate. As soon as that report came out, indigo production in Bengal just collapsed. It was a huge victory for the peasants, a really powerful moment. But the story doesn't quite end there. The planters, they just packed up their bags and moved their whole operation to another region, Bihar, and there they set up the exact same oppressive system. That struggle continued for decades, and it eventually led to one of Mahatma Gandhi's very first major campaigns in India, the Champaran movement in 1917. So, when you look back at this whole story, from a simple trading company becoming the tax master of a nation to a blue dye that trapped millions of people in a cycle of debt, it really forces us to ask a pretty tough question, one that's still incredibly relevant today. What is the true cost of anything when the profit from it is valued more than the lives and the dignity of the people who make it? It's something to think about.